Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called nondual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm being interviewed about my new book, Near Enemies of the Truth. This book came out late last year, and this episode was originally recorded shortly thereafter, and first appeared on the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast, which is the brainchild of Ralph Cree, who has traveled the world and investigated spiritual traditions all over, especially in Asia, and who took a degree in religions and world music at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and has a lot of experience with psychedelics and entheogens as well. That wasn't the subject of this particular conversation, but Ralph brings a varied background to this interview, and it's a great little exploration of some of the dominant themes of near enemies of the truth. And if you are not yet familiar with that book, then this is a good orientation and hopefully will inspire you to read the book itself. Enjoy.
Christopher Harish Wallace, welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. It's a real delight for me because I have been following your work quite closely for a few years now, and it really helped me at a particular time for me. I think I'd ended up a bit with a sort of a bit of a splitting, but spirit matter split kind of conundrum, and the non-dual Tantra, which is what you teach, really helped resolve for the moment that issue for me. And so I've been really into your work for a while, and you're a scholar-practitioner, which I think is a wonderful thing. And I've interviewed, for those listening, Ben Williams, who also is a scholar-practitioner in Tantra, which I think is a wonderful combination, because quite often you get one but not the other. And you've written some great books, which I've read. The Recognition Sutras was a translation you've done, which is currently my favourite spiritual text of all time, which I've read a couple of times, and I probably will read on and off for the rest of my life, I imagine. Tantra Illuminated, which is a very thorough dealing with the topic of Tantra, which I've also read. And you have a website with all sorts of courses on it, and I've done your Foundations of Tantra course, which I highly recommend to everybody. That's a free course. You do workshops in person. I've been to one of those in London. I'm a bit of a fanboy by the sounds of listing all of these things. You have a Facebook page called Tantric Yoga Now, which I frequent and find that really, really helpful. There's a great community of people on there. And you have tons and tons of YouTube videos, which I've watched a lot of. So I think one of the great things I just want to let the audience know about your work is there's loads of it on the internet, really accessible. And at the end, we'll say what the website is. And I know that's the kind of your learning portal hub where it all the tentacles end up in that body of the octopus, so to speak. And your latest book called Near Enemies of the Truth. Where do we have the actual title of it? I just deleted it. Oh no, here we go. Near Enemies of the Truth. Avoid the pitfalls of the spiritual path and become radically free, which I've just finished reading and I absolutely love. And that's what we were going to be discussing today. So there we go. It's a little intro.
I'm glad you mentioned the recognition sutras because, Tantra Illuminated, which is sort of a textbook, I think a fun and accessible textbook, but still a kind of a comprehensive textbook introduction to the tantric tradition. So it sells much better. It's much more popular, but the recognition sutras goes deeper into the teachings of non-dual tantra. And, there are people I highly respect, like Rupert Spira and Michael Taft. They also say it's their favorite spiritual text these days. And so I think it takes a bit of maturity. That's a compliment to you, right? A bit of spiritual maturity to appreciate it more than Tantra Illuminated, which is, again, the more famous work. And then, of course, Near Enemies of the Truth is a very different kind of thing. And because that's aimed at a much, much wider audience, and it's addressing kind of spiritual cliches that are very prevalent in all sorts of spiritual communities. Whereas the Recognition Sutras, as great as that text is a deep dive that can seem esoteric or difficult to people who aren't already familiar with the philosophies of non-dual tantra. So just for your listeners to kind of sketch out the differences of those three books. And I'll just mention there's many more books coming, hopefully 7 more in this lifetime, if I manage it. But yeah, happy to talk about Near Enemies because that's the newest book and it's already a bit controversial, meaning to say there's a lot of people saying, on the one hand, oh, this is great spiritual myth busting, and it's helping bring clarity to a field of confusion and woolly thinking. And then, of course, there's others who are like, their favorite myth got busted in the book and they just think it's wrong and they post negative reviews. And, I'm sure people will see if they look, the reviews are kind of polarized. It's either 5-star or 1-star,
It's not just a book that kind of trashes stuff. It's there's a good new word I've heard called the critosphere, and it's a kind of a flavor of a particular type of internet culture where people just tear things down and criticize things, but they don't offer anything in return. And this book leans very, very hard on some of these misconceptions because they're incredibly important, but it doesn't just leave you in a pile of rubble. You actually offer people the actual profound truth that is actually the essence of that particular inquiry, and also some practices that people can do.
Yeah, exactly. I try to. That's really the point of the book, to criticize or critique. I like that word better. Some of these misunderstood spiritual cliches and platitudes that sort of draws in the reader who felt, yeah, there's something not quite right about these platitudes. But then the real point of the book is to say, well, but also there's a deeper truth that's adjacent to the platitude, or almost captured, but not quite by that cliche. And that's really the point of it, is to investigate the deeper truths that are only hinted at by these everyday spiritual cliches, and to also offer some practices, as you said, guided meditations and contemplations. And that's the part that for the actual practitioner, as opposed to the person who, just likes to read a book that allows them to look down on others, for the actual practitioner, it's those contemplations and meditations that the book is really all about. And can I ask you, Ralph, what was your favorite part of the book, whether it's a chapter or whether it's rather an aspect or an approach that you found in the book? What struck you the most personally in it?
Well, I'd say my favorite thing about it was that it makes what you've written about in the Recognition Sutras and Tantra Illuminated really accessible. So I kind of imagine if you imagine a funnel towards the Recognition Sutras, you might, a listener who'd never come across your work, I mean, I might recommend they start with Near Enemies of the Truth, then read Tantra Illuminated, and then the Recognition Sutras. Because what I was really enjoying was how I think we should if you could define non-dual tantra quickly for listeners as well. But the philosophy of non-dual tantra is really clearly presented in this book in an accessible way. So I think there's always a throat clearing, well, not always a throat clearing, but there's sometimes a throat clearing one has to do when talking about tantra these days, that we're not talking about neotantra, and perhaps you could just define what we're talking about in terms of tantra.
Yeah. And first I'll say that the new book, Near Enemies of the Truth, it draws upon non-dual tantra, but it really seeks to highlight those teachings of that tradition that are also found in some other traditions, other non-dual spiritual traditions. So there's a lot of overlap, of course, with any non-dual tradition, with any other, and also not, meaning to say non-dual tantra has unique teachings that are not found in other traditions, and it has lots of teachings that are also found in other traditions. And with the book, I'm trying to be helpful to those on any spiritual path at all, and that's what's important. It's not sectarian at all, as you know. It's just really trying to provide helpful guidance to someone on any spiritual path, even though, of course, some of the specific insights are sometimes drawn from non-dual tantra, which sometimes just explicates themes in the spiritual life more clearly and precisely, but they're the same themes that we find in spiritual paths worldwide. But to answer your question, just a bit about what is non-dual tantra. Well, to give the full name of the tradition I study, it's non-dual Shaiva tantra, meaning to say it's the version of tantra that flourished in the religion of Shiva and Shakti, which is distinct from but very closely related to the version of tantra that flourished in Buddhism. So a lot of people are familiar to some degree with Tibetan Buddhism. At least everybody's heard of the Dalai Lama. But a lot of people don't realize that Tibetan Buddhism is tantric Buddhism, that it's thoroughly tantric. But it's a particular version of Tantra. It's a Buddhist version, of course, but it's also a Tibetan version, and it's also a monastic version. That is to say, the version of Tantra taught and practiced by people who are primarily Buddhist monks in the Tibetan tradition. So that gives it slightly different flavor. However, not as different as one might think. If one looks at the specific practices, if you're drilling down into the nitty-gritty, as it were, and looking at the specific practices of Tibetan Buddhism, they are largely extremely similar, at least structurally, in terms of form rather than content. They're extremely similar to the practices in every other tantric tradition, Shaiva Tantra and Vaishnava Tantra, the tantric tradition related to the deity Vishnu or Krishna. These are all very similar in terms of their form and structure, and different in terms of their content, meaning to say the specific visualizations, the specific mantras, the specific deities being invoked. But the way in which they work with the subtle body, or also known as the energy body, that's very, very similar across these multiple tantric traditions, because Tantra was originally a spiritual movement that propagated through all the religions that existed in the Indian subcontinent at the time that the movement was happening, which is roughly the 6th century up through the 12th century, and it continued to be influential for several centuries after that as well. I'm just citing the classical period of Tantra. So non-dual Tantra is the version of Tantra that teaches a non-duality of consciousness, meaning to say it teaches a doctrine which can be realized experientially, that consciousness is everything and everything is consciousness. So it's non-dual in the sense that there is nothing but consciousness. But why use the phrase, or the word non-dual, as opposed to the word oneness or monism, right? It's because there appear to be two. There very much appear to be two things in experience, namely consciousness and its contents, or we could say awareness and what you are aware of. For most people, even somewhat experienced meditators, those appear to be distinct. They appear to be very much two. And this is the tradition, or one of the traditions, that teaches, no, in fact, when you look deeper and deeper through your meditative practice, because you don't arrive at this, of course, by thinking about it, but through meditative practice, you can realize that consciousness manifests as its contents, that all the substance of what you are aware of is made of nothing but awareness. So that is what makes it non-dual, of course. So non-dual Tantra then is a system of practice, because the word Tantra literally means system, or a system of practice. And it's a system of practice aimed at whatever version of the goal is being articulated in some specific lineage, because it's a lineage-based tradition, meaning to say different lineages have different versions of the goal of practice, and some are more dualistic, that seek a kind of transcendence of everyday life, a transcendence of the world and the body and the senses, and others are such as this non-dual kind I'm talking about. They don't seek a transcendence. Well, it's said that one must have the transcendent experience of the absolute, but then the goal is to integrate that transcendent experience of the absolute with every nuance of everyday life, to realize the transcendent absolute in and as the substance of everyday experience. And so again, that's what makes it non-dual. So it's a system of practice aimed at a goal, in this case, non-dual realization. And so as a non-dual system of practice, it entails everything in life that can be leveraged toward this realization. So that is to say, there's nothing that's excluded. So in some religions, of course, sexuality, for example, is excluded from religious practice. It's something sinful. It's something distinct from religious practice. And for that matter, everyday activities like, eating or going for a walk, they're not religious practice. And in non-dual Tantra, anything can be a religious practice when done with awareness, mindfulness, and the cultivation of non-dual insight. So Therefore, everything's included, and one can explore one's sexuality as a non-dual spiritual practice. One can explore one's relationship to food and eating as a non-dual practice. And this is what led to the widespread misunderstanding of the word Tantra. Now, this misunderstanding is already 100 years old, so it's extremely entrenched. This misunderstanding has been propagated in the West for such a long time through generations, that Tantra is specifically about sex or sexuality. And indeed, what we call neotantra is, that is to say, this Western invention, which can be perfectly beneficial for some people, but it's not really related to the original tantric tradition, because Western neo-tantra came about on the basis of hearsay, just hearing about that there was this spiritual practice that somehow involves sexuality. So that's quite a long story. A lot of academics have written about that. But long story short, the Western, what we call neo-tantra, which is exactly what is taught in any workshop that advertises tantric sex, any book, any workshop, any online webinar that uses the phrase tantric sex is actually drawing on this Western 100-year-old tradition that has virtually no connection with the Indian tradition of the same name. So that exactly is the confusion. And when we look at the sexual practices that are given in the original tantric tradition, they bear almost zero similarity to the sexual practices taught in modern neo-tantra under the name of tantric sex. So therefore, unfortunately, it isn't the case that if you go to a tantric sex workshop, you're at least getting a little taste of what the original tradition offered on this subject. Usually you're not. There's some rare exceptions. There's some teachers of neo-tantra that have gone on to study classical tantra and try to integrate the two, but these are few and far between. So that, I hope, clears up the confusion on that point.
It's my kind of tongue-in-cheek publicity stunt that I'm not really going to do this, but if I put in the title of this YouTube video we're doing now, Tantric Master has sex for 12 hours, you won't believe what happens next. I can guarantee 1 million views, but yeah, that's my little joke.
Yeah, but then they'll rapidly discover that's nothing but
I know, that's right. But I think it's important for you to have said what you've just said, because the theme of non-dual tantra is the kind of the soil out of which this book, Near Enemies of the Truth, has grown, because you are a tantric scholar and practitioner. And it obviously, that word comes up a lot in the book. And I think one of the things that would be good to do is to talk about what a near enemy is. And I think there's a good quote here. I'm just going to pull out from your book. You say, when we're talking about deep and fundamental truths, getting it a little bit wrong doesn't much matter in the short term, but it very much matters in the long term. Just like a tiny adjustment to the rudder of your boat makes little difference at first, but after 2,000 miles, it lands you on a different continent. And that's the kind of bullseye of, what this inquiry, the importance of this inquiry is. So if you could please just define what you mean by a near enemy of the truth, I think that would be really helpful for people listening to this.
Yeah. Well, first, let me talk about truth a little bit, because that itself is a naughty concept. And indeed, it's difficult to talk about in words, because, of course, real truth, deep truth, is ineffable, meaning to say it can't be said in words. We can only approximate it in words. And so a lot of people have the idea, that through spiritual practice or through mystical experience, it's possible to have a direct revelation of truth, which is unmediated by psychology or culture, uninfluenced by any of those factors. It's absolutely pure. But in fact, this is very, very difficult. Possible, I grant, but extremely rare, because when people engage in spiritual practice or inquiry or contemplation of any kind, they are bringing to that endeavor all kinds of cultural programming and assumptions. And a lot of this cultural programming, of course, has the guise of spirituality and spiritual philosophy. But still, whatever you've absorbed in terms of words and concepts, that constitutes a prior bias. And in spirituality, just as much as anywhere else, confirmation bias is very much a thing. So you can have what seems to be a revelation or an epiphany, but it's nearly always very much influenced by the mental baggage that you're bringing into the practice that then yields that very epiphany. So the only way around this conundrum is to engage in a systematic process of deconstruction. And the deconstruction that I allude to is one in which you strip away narratives and concepts from experience relentlessly over the course of years of practice until you're experiencing without concepts and without narratives. Some people think that's impossible, but it is possible. It just takes a lot of work. And of course, that means not applying any labels, because even a one-word label is already a narrative. If you're experiencing a heat or intensity, energy in your body, and you call it anger, that's already a narrative. If you call this experience of heat, intensity, and energy in the body anger, it's because there's already a story in play in your mind about why you're experiencing this. And without that story, there is no anger. There's just the raw intensity or heat or energy. And that goes for all the other emotions too. So I just mentioned this to illustrate that there can be narratives that consist only of one word, and yet they are still narratives and bring with them all the baggage associated with that word. So this deconstruction process that I'm talking about has to go very deep for it to be truly effective. We have to see that even the notion, I am a man, I am a woman, I am a person, has to be stripped away. That is a narrative that influences the frames that we put on experience. So if you go through this process, as I have myself and many others have, and let me tell you, it's quite grueling at times. It's not the pleasant version of spirituality, but we go through this grueling process because in the end, there is an incredible bliss and joy and wonder of aliveness, which is not available in its fullness without going through the deconstruction process. Now, why get into all this in this moment? Precisely because you can't say anything about how well or how badly words approximate truth if you're not experiencing truth. And for that, the deconstruction process is needed. Now, some listeners are going to say, like, wait a second, this guy claims to be experiencing real truth. Is there even such a thing? And if there is, how can he claim to experience it? Well, okay, first of all, there is such a thing. It's just, again, ineffable. It's non-conceptual. It's that which we all share in common without most of us even realizing that we do. And to claim to experience truth is not such an extraordinary claim. In fact, there are many, many, many people, who knows how many, but certainly worldwide, at a guess, certainly hundreds of thousands of people who have gone through this process that I'm talking about. And many of them have gone through the process without attaching a word to it, which can so easily cause it to go off the rails. A word such as enlightenment, and I talk about that in the book a bit.
But we'll definitely get into that later.
Yeah. So to bring it full circle here, that to be intimate with reality is a possibility for every human being. I'm not claiming to be some extraordinary Buddha. Anyone who devotes some years of their life in which this is the top priority can verify what I'm talking about, that there is such a thing as wordless, non-conceptual truth shared in common by all conscious beings that most of them just overlook because they are so caught up in their concepts. And then once we're sensing that, and it's not to say that any one person could sense it from all possible angles of perception, because even though there's one truth, one could say fundamentally, it can be sensed from sort of many possible angles, all of them non-conceptual, and any one person can't sense all the angles. Okay, but even sensing some of them, you can then see there's something magical that happens. Really, you can read anything from the words of Jesus or the words attributed to Jesus in the Bible or other religious texts and see, oh wow, you sense what they are approximating, and you sense how they were distorted over time, but you sense where they were coming from. And that's the important thing, because the exact words can't capture it, but they're coming from somewhere that is very, very real. Okay, so a near enemy of the truth in this context is a teaching or phrase or saying or platitude that approximates a deep truth, but it doesn't approximate it skillfully enough to be effective in the long term, as the quote you mentioned points out. It might approximate it skillfully enough to be effective in the short term, especially for beginners, right? So people come to the spiritual path and they hear about be in the present moment, or follow your bliss, or you create your own reality, or everything happens for a reason. And these sayings can be super effective in the beginning because they provide a different kind of orientation from our mainstream consumerist culture. And that initial orientation is effective. I'm not saying it's not. It's effective for many, many, many people. But any single phrase, kind of bumper sticker phrase or easy to say platitude is not going to approximate the truth well enough to be sustainable in the long term. So then we need to look deeper and inquire into what is this attempting to approximate that's actually much more nuanced. So the book is a reworking of the concept of near enemies of the truth, because in everyday Buddhism, the phrase near enemy of the truth is used in a quite simple way, such as the following: the near enemy of compassion is pity. The near enemy of love is attachment, and so on. So in those sayings, which are very valuable sayings, by the way, and I agree with them, but in those sayings, it's relatively simple. You're just saying, okay, compassion, as we define it, and there needs to be, of course, a definition, is something much more powerful and impactful and relevant than pity, which can look like compassion. And indeed, pity could even be called compassion by someone who doesn't yet have developed and mature understanding, just as attachment could easily be called love by someone who doesn't yet have mature and developed understanding. But the contrast is a single word, even though those words, of course, need to be defined by the teacher who is using them. Whereas in the book, I'm saying that the truth to which these phrases are merely near enemies, that is not going to be articulatable in a single phrase. So what I don't do in the book is say, okay, you create your own reality is the near enemy of blank, and fill in the blank with a simple expression that the former one is the near enemy of, because these particular near enemies are the truths to which they're adjacent are sufficiently nuanced and subtle that you cannot sum them up in a single phrase. And that means the reader has to do a bit of work, namely reading the book, right? Because wouldn't it be easy? I wouldn't even have had to write a book. I could just give a few talks on, oh, no, this is the near enemy of that. And if that was easily articulatable. But if you're interested in mature spirituality, and ever evolving spirituality, to reference the name of your podcast, that you need to be willing to go beyond that which can become a sound bite, right? If you can use sound bites in your head to remember a more complex teaching. That's the original purpose of a sutra in the tradition. It's a soundbite that helps you remember a more nuanced teaching, but you cannot be satisfied with the soundbite if you want real mature spirituality. So going into the nuance and realizing, oh, I can't just hang on to a mental phrase, a mental image, a simple takeaway. And that's, of course, the problem, if I'm going to get on this hobby horse, with modern culture, modern internet culture, YouTube culture, etc., is that people want, what's the takeaway? What's the simple, easy to remember takeaway? Now, there may be such takeaways, in the realm of health and care for the body. It's like, get sunlight in your eyes first thing in the morning, exercise 30 minutes a day. These are perfectly accurate takeaways that are helpful to people. But when it comes to spirituality, which by definition is ultimately a non-conceptual thing, there cannot be simple, easy, one phrase takeaways, except in the sense of mnemonics, to a much, much deeper, subtler contemplation. And that's the challenge. That's why spirituality cannot be packaged into bite-sized chunks easily, and that it is not disseminated in social media very effectively. And of course, I myself put little quotes on social media, on Instagram or whatever, but those quotes are actually serving as reminders to people who've received deeper teaching. I am under no illusion that somebody could just read the quote on an Instagram meme and experience some real insight or enlightenment from that.
Well, yeah, very, very important things you said. And so I think what can confuse people sometimes is you get these very pithy, sometimes in when you're using mantras and things, it can be a single syllable that in a kind of the idea of chunking, you've got, or a pyramid, you've got an enormous amount of nuanced philosophy and practice, thousands of years of people practicing, recording, and this whole project. You could sum up in, if you're thinking of nondual tantra, for example, in the mantra Om, which one translation you offered a while back was that Om means yes. And I love the way you said it was, it's yes. For me, uh, that that it can encapsulate decades of really hard graft. For me, I hear that and it reminds me of, it brings together decades of hard work and
Yeah.
you know, uh, so there is a place for all of that, as you say, but it's Pete, and I think we, being internet literate is as important for people into in spirituality as anybody else. Using social media, not getting scammed. It's like you're playing chess against the algorithms you're working against on the internet are like chess grandmasters, and you're like some noob on a chessboard. And all of this is really important, and I think which is one of the reasons why this book is so important now. And there's a podcast I've been listening to a lot recently, and I hope to interview them. It's called Conspirituality. And although I don't agree with all of it, and honestly, I find them a little bit politically partisan, but I listen to that podcast all the time for the very reason that it sometimes pisses me off. And it's like, those are the areas, it's really important to pour some of this acid on your own sacred cows or idols, so I think
Yeah, I know those guys, by the way. I know
mm,
the conspirituality guys, and I know a couple of them fairly well.
yeah,
Yeah, and it's a good podcast most of the time.
yeah. So in your book, you've got 17 near enemies, and as you say, each one of these is incredibly nuanced. I originally encountered this material of yours via your YouTube video. So you did like an hour-long YouTube video on each one of these. That became the book, and you've got an entire chapter on all of these ones, and it's a large book. So really, people ought to read the book to get the full unpacking of all of these. There were a few that I wanted to just open up a little bit with you, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I do, I'll just quickly list all 17, just so people have got an idea of, the kind of what we're talking about here. So you've got follow your bliss, speak your truth, be your best self, be in the moment, listen to your heart, love yourself, everything happens for a reason, everything happens for the best, find your soul's purpose, you create your own reality, you can choose how to respond, negative energy and negative emotions, energy healing, I am my own guru, the universe has given me a sign, and go with the flow. And then you've got a whole nother section, part 2, you call Finding Deeper Currents, where you talk about these concepts, reality, enlightenment, ego, non-duality, and surrender. So so much rich ground there. But I think if I just open up one or two of them for a bit of discussion, I think for people that perhaps regularly listen to this podcast, these might be of particular interest to them, and they're of interest to me. And so if we look at be your best self, and I'll just start with a quote that you have here. So this is quoting from your book. We imagine the possibility that we could at some point in the future consistently be as good and kind and loving as we were on our best day ever. Then we call these imagined possibilities our potential or our best self. But you see the problem. If you think this way, you are creating a situation in which you almost constantly fail to live up to how you think you should be, necessitating some version of self-hatred as a result. Ironically, believing that you are not as you should be drains you of the very life energy that would otherwise allow you to contribute to the world. So this sounded very familiar to me. And one thing I will say about all of these near enemies of the truth here. All of these have affected me at some point in the past and will do in the future. And I think it's important to lay that out there, because it's like, yeah. So how this relates to experiences I've had. So psychedelics has been quite a large part of my journey, but you can probably tell by the backdrop behind me. One of the things that happens with the use of psychedelics is you experience these absolutely sublime states. I mean, if I took one as an example, I mean, this isn't necessarily psychedelic, but if MDMA, you experience love. So the first time I took MDMA, I experienced love like I'd never experienced it before. It was absolutely, well, people know what everyone talks about MDMA. And then once it wears off, suddenly you're back to where you were, and you've had this, what you've experienced, to going back to your quote, on your very best day ever.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're like, well, I want that all the time, because you know how good it is. And if you can relate this to deep state meditation practice, some sublime kundalini experience, those kind of things. And then you start comparing your everyday experience of life to that, and things can seem very flat. Normal relationships can seem flat. You can end up thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be like that all the time? So that was something that when I read that chapter, that was something that came up for me as an experience that over decades of experience with different psychedelics, I've kind of come to terms with that more. I got an understanding of that's the nuance that happens with practice. But that was one of the things that came up for me. The states of consciousness, non-ordinary, extraordinary states of consciousness versus your everyday reality experience, and that feeds into another near enemy of the truth that you deal with later, which is, I can't remember which one it is, but basically that the one being who we all are is actually perfectly at home with this moment just as it is. And
Yeah, when I first tried MDMA myself, I had a slightly different experience. I was like, wow, thank God I have a meditation practice, because otherwise I'd get addicted to this drug, right?
Yeah.
Because the expansive, open-hearted feeling was familiar to me as a side effect of meditation, and that what now, MDMA can have a number of different effects, of course, we should note. Like for those who have PTSD, it can activate the trauma, and in a way that allows for healing if a skilled professional is facilitating, right? So for some people, they take MDMA and they experience their trauma, they experience fear, they experience all sorts of things. So it's not a simple thing like people who haven't taken it imagine, oh, you take a pill and you just feel happy. It's not that simple at all. It takes us into our emotional core, but it also gives us access to something deeper than the emotional core. And that is ideally for the right person who takes it, they experience this incredibly profound okayness. Everything is okay, actually. I'm okay, just as I am, and everything is. And so, again, on a good MDMA experience or ideal one, you touch into that. And what I would argue is that is actually tasting or experiencing or touching into our deepest nature. That is to say, our deepest nature as conscious beings includes, as an intrinsic part of it, what the tantric tradition calls ananda. And ananda, of course, is just often translated as bliss, but it's actually something deeper and more interesting than bliss, at least in the tantric understanding. It's this profound sense of okayness or beauty or gratitude in that's possible in any life circumstance. So ananda is, at least again in the tantric sense of the word, it's completely untranslatable, because it might not feel like bliss at all. It might just feel like a deep loving acceptance of pain, the ability to see the beauty in pain, to see how it helps you be more compassionate and open to others and connect with others. You know, if you realize how pain can be a force for human connection and compassion, then you see the beauty in it. And I'm not talking, of course, conceptually. I'm not talking about understanding this with your mind, but having a direct, very visceral experience of it. That's very, very, very different, right? So ananda kind of covers all this ground, and so if MDMA introduces people to this ananda, great. But the point, from my perspective and the perspective of many other meditation teachers I know, is to convince people, oh, what you've been introduced to is actually intrinsic to your true nature. It's not just a product of the drug. Yes, of course, the drug has its own kind of neurological effects, like, you know, you're getting an all over body high or tingle. That's that's just the drug, right? But it can also give you access to something which is intrinsic in your true nature. And so through meditative practice, if we access this deeper and deeper without the drug, then it is possible, and I speak from experience, but there's many other people who testify to this, that it's possible to feel this profound sense of okayness, even blessedness, in the midst of a very challenging circumstance that elicits profound grief, for example. And that's a very different experience. You know, if you have a tragic incident in your life that elicits deep grief, and you don't have this connection to the profound okayness at the core of our being, then it can feel like, at worst, it can feel like, you know, God hates you. It's like, or the universe is a cold, unfeeling, unfriendly place. And there, you know, that's a terrible, terrible feeling. And it turns out it's wrong, but it's a very convincing feeling when you don't have access to this deep, for lack of a better word, okayness that again is intrinsic to our true nature. So it's interesting that there's an actual argument here, in the philosophical sense of the word argument, that the tradition wants to say, actually, it is intrinsic. It's not just an unpredictable epiphenomenon. No, it's this ananda is intrinsic to our true nature, and a sufficiently deep spiritual practice can prove that for absolutely anyone. And of course, it's going to be harder for some than others to come to the direct visceral actualization of that promise. But it's a startling promise, and I hope some listeners take it seriously if they haven't already. And it really is so different from the feel good that you get from believing nice things, right? It's something so much deeper than that. So that's why, you know, psychedelics are very much not irrelevant. Now, of course, as you said, MDMA, it's not a classical psychedelic. But it is a psychoactive thing. But that and classical psychedelics can give us access to something very, very, very real and foundational in the nature of consciousness. But the problem is those psychedelics also come with sort of bells and whistles, like hallucinations or body highs or artifacts of the specific drug that could easily be confused with what is being revealed. Meaning to say, somebody might get the wrong idea that spiritual experience, when it's authentic, is extremely intense or extremely sensual, or it's an altered state, and those are actually the artifacts of the drugs, that you can have the same fundamental spiritual experience without these alterations in perception, for example. But if you haven't had them through meditation, then usually you don't know the difference, and therefore psychedelic users tend to fetishize extraordinary experience, when actually the experience of our true nature is deeply, I almost said ordinary. It's not ordinary, it's extraordinary, but in a very, very sweetly simple way. It's of course not capturable in words, but it's not an altered state, right?
Yeah.
It's going deeper into the pure beingness that we sensed even as little children, but didn't appreciate the fullness of.
I think we do experience that or recognize it more in formal meditation, sitting meditation practice, because there's less distractions from this. And I've been meditating for decades too, and it's taken me a long time to consistently recognize the radically open nature of my essence. When I say my, I don't necessarily mean
our
personally,
essence,
but yeah, our essence, my, our, it's all, they all kind of collapse into one. But and it is a different type of recognition thing than psychedelic states, I'd say, in my experience. It's more like the big kahuna. It's the undoing what they call the ahamkara, the eye maker, or the knot at the heart of yourself, the kind of central contraction. Knowing that that is actually always undone, and actually feeling that in your own, the core of your own self. That's the kind of, having done a lot of all of these sort of things, in my opinion, is the one worth focusing on most in your life, because one's life. It's the kind of root of all of these other things, really. Or maybe that's not quite the right word, but if you're going to do one thing, that would be my recommendation for one thing to focus on in one's life.
The one thing being untying the knot of the
untying
heart,
and recognizing one's own essential nature, essence nature, as
yeah,
you put it. There's a lot of distractions that can get you off that course, but some of these things point the way. But there's so much more we could say about that. One of the things that you hint at in this particular Near Enemy of the Tree, be your best self, and I've heard you mention other times, is that cultural evolution and the evolution of consciousness is kind of a bullshit concept. And I might be misinterpreting what you're saying. But I was very influenced at a certain point, quite a few years ago, by the work of developmental psychology the work of Ken Wilber, these kind of things. And if on a personal level, children clearly develop through psychological and emotional cognitive stages as they grow. And we're kind of, in the modern West, we think that that stops once you hit 18 or 21, but it doesn't have to. I think my own view is that one can keep on growing through one's life. And there are people that, like Ken Wilber, who have kind of mapped that a similar kind of developmental trajectory onto culture. And this tends to be the more controversial aspect of it. I think developmental psychology is quite a there's been lots of experiments done in that over a long. It's quite a rigorous topic.
Well established.
Well established, yeah. But I think one of the simple ways people talk about the cultural evolution is so in kind of lines of moral development, and how en masse humans have more rights now than they used to in thousand years ago or something, en masse. And that because tribes were more splintered and interacted with each other less, there was kind of more, you was kind of surrounded a bit more with enemies, when then with the development of city states, large groups of people came together and those kind of things. And so, I mean, it's a very, very big topic, quite a subtle one, and there's lots of people that critique it, and I don't think people were obviously very intelligent in the past, and intelligence is very specific to the world you live in, and people have to just deal with different things than they used to in the past. But do you see some developmental trajectory in culture in terms of morality, say? And I mean, I know we could talk about wars and all of these kind of things, but
yeah. So the interesting thing is, we don't have anywhere near enough data to come to such conclusions. These are extremely premature conclusions, given that, as Tim Urban put it, if the entire history of humanity, since we had language, the very beginning of language, if the entire history of humanity was a 1,000-page book, then everything that's happened in the last 100 years is the final page of that 1,000-page book, and already on the second to last page of that book, we've got the American Civil War, and just a couple of pages back, we've got the medieval period, which was obviously profoundly unenlightened from our perspective. So there's absolutely no way to say that this is anything but an aberration, right? Like some good ideas somehow managed to get centered in some cultures, right? And those good ideas, like the civil society, like the public square, like civil discourse, like and we could talk about many more, but did they get centered because humans are getting innately more developed or innately more moral? I would suspect not. I would suspect that those good ideas got centered primarily for economic reasons and reasons of political stability. People like political stability because then economies can flourish. And it so happens that some of these very good ideas, which are independently good, I would say, they happen to get centered for reasons of political and economic expediency. And in terms of developmental psychology, well, it seems to me that the majority of humans stall, right? Meaning to say, they do develop, of course they develop, but most adults are still overgrown adolescents. The thing is that fact is concealed by the development of superficial social norms, meaning to say, most adults can behave politely, but under the surface, most people are still emotionally adolescent, and their spouses know this, and so their other family members know this, right? If they bother to, of course, some people just repress it relentlessly, but if they do express some of their true feelings and thoughts, then their spouses know how adolescent they can be. And I include myself in this in this criticism up until at least not all that long ago. The thing is, our society and our culture doesn't give us the tools to successfully mature out of adolescence. We have to find our way with it, and if we do find our way with it, we find our way over the course of a couple of decades. But in a truly mature, truly sane society, people would be given the tools to mature beyond an emotionally adolescent mentality by the age of 24, 25. That is to say, for example, developing an ego. Well, that's a normal part of development, right? But then people are just stuck with it for the rest of their lives. Usually, most people go to their graves with this utterly intractable ego, which almost entirely lacks the power of self-reflection and blames everyone else for how life didn't go the way it should have done. And that's more the common, that's more the norm than the exception, unfortunately, right? But in this imagined, hypothetical, truly sane society, you develop an ego in adolescence, and then you transcend it in your 20s, right? Because the ego has served its purpose, and it's no longer needed. And you achieve true adulthood in your 20s, which most people never do. Now, if you're lucky, like myself and possibly some listeners, you manage to achieve true adulthood eventually in your 40s, in your 50s, but you got to keep working on it. That's the thing. It's like being in school. Like you said, you can keep growing in your life, depending on what you mean by growth, but you have to be committed to something like being in school nonstop, right? You got to work at it. And then you might manage to see that all your self-images are nothing but mind stuff. They're just a bunch of thoughts. They're not worth defending. They're not worth trying to prove oneself to others that, oh, I'm really a good person and you misunderstood me. And we waste a huge amount of time in defending our self-images rather than connecting with the humans that we love. They're upset about something we did, and we go immediately into self-defense, and that's the ego. And if you find yourself going into self-defense, no matter what age you are, you still have an adolescent ego, as most people do. So I would prefer, instead of fantasy notions of evolution, I would prefer a sober assessment of how immature we truly are as a species, and that none of us can do anything about the species, but we can do something about ourselves, right? And so if enough of us prioritize that maturation process, that difficult one, which involves, yes, admitting how childish we can be even as adults, then maybe that there's a chance for species-wide development not based on ideologies. See, this is the difference, not based on just centering some good ideas that happen to create a more stable society, but based on actual real development. That's different from just believing certain thoughts. I believe in capitalism, I believe in individualism, but rather developing organically, then it's possible. But we would have to overcome as a species some huge challenges, because we still have more than half the planet subject to religious ideologies which are taken to be literally true, and which absolutely prevent any kind of inner work when they are taken to be literally true. So sorry if that's a more pessimistic view, but sobriety about the real challenges facing us, that's the only way forward. We can only take real steps forward when we're grounded in our real situation.
Yeah.
By the way, sorry for such long answers, but
well,
also you ask questions that deserve long answers. They can't be answered briefly.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and that that should be going thinking back to our earlier conversation about takeaways. To allow us to have a takeaway from this conversation for those listening. These are all very, very nuanced and subtle things that are in this book, Near Enemies, and each one of them requires a lot of contemplation, conversation with people, reading the book. It's so
yeah. And by the way, the book does have a chapter on ego and how ego is frequently misunderstood, right? Because these later chapters that you mentioned, reality and enlightenment and ego and so on, the argument there is that the popular understanding of these concepts is itself a near enemy to the more beneficial understanding. Like that when people think they understand what ego means, what reality means, what enlightenment means, that understanding is nearly always a near enemy to the truth that term could more usefully denote.
Yeah. Well, maybe if we go on to this next one. Well, it's not next in the list in the way it comes into the book, but this is kind of related to kind of what we were talking about, giving people the best opportunities to have an authentic spiritual life, and one that's not ideologically bound. For example, you say here in Near Enemy number 15, all paths lead to the same goal, and then you have got this whole chapter about how that's a near enemy of the truth, and that there's things wrong with that sentiment, but it's kind of hinting at something. So my question with this is, whether a world spirituality, so let's say looking very, very long term, cultures have been quite isolated historically up until more recent times, and then possibly going forwards in the future becoming a more planetary species with that at the forefront of people's minds and cultures and around the planet. That I wonder about the possibility of some kind of world spirituality happening that's similar to I don't know if you know about mixed martial arts, sometimes referred to as cage fighting, UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championships. Do you know about that?
Yeah, a good friend of mine, Mark Jenko, he is a MMA fighter, and he actually wrote a book about the spirituality that can be experienced through MMA. That's called Inner Jiu-Jitsu. That's his book. So if you're interested in that stuff, you might check it out.
Well, so what I mean by that is, for the whole history of humanity, we've had lots of different traditions of martial arts. You've had kung fu, wrestling. You've got striking traditions where you're punching, kicking, ones which are grappling ones, kind of like wrestling, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. What happened with mixed martial arts, the very first UFC competition in the early 90s. They said, well, look, let's bring all of these people together and they can all fight, and then we'll see who wins. And it turned out that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was the master skill at that time, because if a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner could take someone to the ground, no matter how good they were at boxing and kicking, they would win. But then people learned how to deal with that and to stop being taken down to the ground. But the essence of what I'm speaking about is that now there's this new thing as arisen called mixed martial arts, which outperforms any single traditional martial art form. So if you put a boxer in a ring against a mixed martial arts fighter, they will lose, because they haven't got a ground game when the fight goes to the ground. If you have someone who only is a wrestler, if they get punched by someone who understands punching and kicking, then it doesn't matter how good they are at wrestling. You know what I'm saying? So there's this actual new art form which has only been around since about 1990, called mixed martial arts, which actually outperforms any one single traditional art form.
Yeah. So I see where you're going.
My question is that in a nutshell, where we find ourselves now, we have shamanic traditions, Western psychology, the wisdom of the East, and I know wisdom of the East, that is
sure
a ridiculously oversimplistic thing, and there's so many different traditions within the East that all say different things. But is there any value? I think this is probably what I'm asking. Is there any value in thinking, or even trying to create, a planetary dharma? So I don't know whether you know, what's his name, John Churchill. You come across him? No. So planetary dharma is what he calls it. Is that a fool's errand?
It's funny that you ask this question, because only a few years ago, and for all of my life up until then, I would have said, yes, that's a fool's errand. Syncretism doesn't work in spirituality as much as New Age type people want it to. It just doesn't. But now my answer is different, but it's a qualified answer. So I used to be more sectarian, and so I was against syncretism. And now I see that syncretism on the level of practice can be perfectly effective if it's grounded in an understanding of the path. So I'll explain what I mean. And I'm actually really glad you asked this question, because it leads to a very, very important discussion and an important possibility to put on the table, namely that there is one spiritual path dressed up in lots of different costumes that we call, Sufism and Tantra and Christian mysticism and Kabbalah and, all sorts of different names, Taoism, and, it doesn't, there's so many different versions. But what I mean when I say one spiritual path dressed up in different costumes is I mean to say that the spiritual path is actually the same fundamentally for all who walk it. And they can walk it in the context of these culturally different religions or spiritualities, right? But it's actually even more subtle than that, because it's even more accurate, rather than saying one spiritual path in different costumes. It's even more accurate to say that the one truly effective spiritual path is stumbled upon by people in all these different contexts, and they interpret it using the tools of their specific tradition. So meaning to say, whether it's Taoism or Christian mysticism or Tantra or anything else, we have examples of people who are awake using the tools of their tradition to try to talk about awakeness and how to actualize it. And then we have other people within the same exact tradition who are not awake. That is to say, they are simply dogmatic adherents of that tradition. And they're using very, very similar language. And you can't really tell the difference without some substantial awakeness yourself. But once, you know, the awakening process gets going for somebody, then they can tell the difference that I'm talking about here. And the reason it's hard is because, again, it's the same language that's being deployed, but it's being deployed in different ways by the dogmatic adherent and by the spiritually awake person. It's only superficially similar, but of course, most people are superficial in their engagement, so they don't notice. So, in other words, what we need as a species, I think, is to recognize, first of all, that awakening is real. That it is an actual process that is as much physiological as it is spiritual. That is to say, it's a process that subsumes your whole humanity. And well, someday we'll have studies, and it's already starting now, actually, but someday we'll have a proper array of studies showing the physiological and neurological correlates of this awakening process, which absolutely subsumes and impacts the whole of our humanity, when it's authentic, right? When it's not just an ideology or a religion or whatever. So then ultimately, I think we'll be able to map and say, okay, look, there's these stages. Now in the book there, in the Enlightenment chapter, I give 5 stages, but this is not meant to be an authoritative map. This is the way it is, people. No, these are just 5 of the most commonly recognized stages in different spiritual traditions. And I would say they pertain to the spiritual path, the one spiritual path, which is discovered by individuals in these different traditions. But you could map it differently. You could absolutely map, you could say, no, there's 7 stages, no, there's 10. No, you could map it differently, but that's not the point. It's not about this map or that map. It's about the fact that there's a singular process of awakening, and the different maps are just highlighting different elements of that process. They're breaking it down in different ways, because what's one stage in one tradition could be broken into 2 stages in another tradition, and perhaps with pedagogical value. So this is really interesting once we see, okay, these maps, when they emerge from lived experience of awakening, not from religious ideology, they all are attempts to map fundamentally the same terrain. And that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because it's possible within the terrain of awakening to sort of end up in a bit of a cul-de-sac, and think you've got to the end of the road. Not to say there's a literal end to the road, by the way. So it's a little bit more complicated. But in other words, if we had this understanding of the process of awakening as it instantiates for all people, though sometimes in different orders, by the way, I should say the stages don't always come in the same order for each person, but they are fundamentally the same stages, whichever order they occur in, and they entail the same insights. Now, if we had that understanding, and it has to be developed in conversation over a lot more time, then there could be a total syncretism of practice. Then it could be a wonderful free-for-all, meaning to say, if you're trying to actualize this particular stage of awakening, perhaps a practice from Taoism is going to help. Perhaps an insight from Kabbalah is going to help. Perhaps the words of a Christian mystic are going to help. Perhaps a particular tantric yoga practice is going to help. But it's going to help in the context where you have a sense of the landscape, both what you've traversed experientially and what you haven't yet traversed, which you know from the maps given to you by those who have traversed. Then you could the syncretism, like we want as much syncretism as possible in that context, because who knows what's going to actually help or work for a given individual trying to take the next step in their development. That's not really exactly the right word, but the unfolding of this process, which can happen all by itself, by the way. It can just happen all by itself, where you're just along for the ride and you're just hanging on for dear life, actually. But it doesn't happen by itself all the time for most people, meaning to say you kind of get stuck at a certain point and you need the next insight or the next or some key practice to break you through that stuckness. And that's where the syncretism could be useful. But of course, the analogy to MMA is gonna break down, because we need this underlying thing to make the syncretism effective, which is the understanding of the path, which we're still in our infancy, I would say. People like Ken Wilber notwithstanding, we're still in our infancy, because we need much more malleable versions of the path rather than what Ken and other people have outlined in his books, where we understand the different forms of language that are pointing to the same thing, and the different order that the stages could come in and still be valid and legitimate. So we need this much more organic, fluid, malleable map of the path of awakening, that could then empower a radical syncretism, which is not currently going to be very effective for most people.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy could be made between awakening and combat effectiveness in the martial arts ring. You know, what works. So MMA is a kind of post-ideological martial art form. Doesn't matter what you can bring any ideas you like into the octagon of UFC about how great your tradition is and your masters
Right.
can do all this stuff, but if you get your ass kicked, that, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
So I think the same can apply to you know, the spiritual path in terms of awakening. The proof's in the pudding, and you know, I'm very interested in undoing ideology on an individual and collective way.
I'm also interested in dismantling ideology. It's just that we have to make this very subtle and kind of difficult distinction between ideology and understanding, whereby somebody might think, if I'm talking about an understanding of the spiritual path, like the understanding that we must dismantle the ego, meaning to say we must recognize that our self-images are thoughts, and they don't actually constitute a self, that a self isn't made of thoughts. That recognition is the same in any version of the spiritual path, though it may be dressed up again in different words, right? And so somebody, if I'm teaching about that, oh, you know, you've got to dismantle the ego sooner or later on this path, somebody might think that's a doctrine, and that's the thing, right? Because doctrine becomes easily ideology, but it's not. It's an understanding of what's a necessary part of this process that everybody who's undergone the process agrees about, even if they quibble over the exact language, right? So that's the thing, is, you know what I mean? Because it's what I'm talking about is different from Hatha Yoga, which is analogous to MMA, where Hatha Yoga tradition says, doesn't matter what you think, doesn't matter what you believe, doesn't matter what you understand, just do these practices in this way, and they will produce the goal. They will produce enlightenment, if you just do the practices in this way. But history has shown that that's not true. Like, a lot of people have tried to do the exact practices in the exact way prescribed, and they do not automatically become Buddhas, you know?
And that's why in non-dual Shiva Tantra, for example, they say that the view or the philosophical context of within which those practices are done are as important as the practices. And I think the thing I like about non-dual Shiva Tantra is that the view, the philosophical framework within which it sits within has been stripped down. Occam's razor has been used a lot on it, and there's a kind of a very essential nature to it. There's not a lot. I mean, yeah, again, this is a generalization because you'll find ornate floweriness, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, as a kind of correlate to it. But the essence of it, there is a version which doesn't have a lot of what you might call religious beliefs in it. Yeah,
that's the version I teach, because you can certainly find people teaching the same tradition in a much more religious way. But it doesn't, but the tradition itself allows for both possibilities. The tradition itself teaches a kind of direct path version of itself, and a much more Baroque version of itself.
Yeah. I'll just comment on this one rather than you go into, but under the chapter Enlightenment, one of the things you go into is the problem, the historical problem of translating Western scholars. So I went to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where a lot of these ethnographers were trained. They went over they weren't practitioners themselves, in most cases. They went to different countries, learn about these different traditions, and then they had to find words to describe what they were talking, to translate what they're talking about. So you've talked about Ananda and those kind of things. They come up with some terms which create as many problems, well, probably more problems than they answers. They answer anything. Enlightenment is one of them. And I recently interviewed Dr. Roger Walsh, and he said deaf to enlightenment as a term. And I think there's one thing I just want to point out to people. One that really took me up the garden path was emptiness. I think is a very problematic translation of shunyata. And I mean, people can go to Wikipedia and look up the term shunyata, and there's so many different translations of that. But that, for me, that was a very fertile chapter. And there's so many bad, I don't know, the people did the best they could at the time, but they're just ultimately bad translations of words that get stuck. Once people start using it, it's out there in the culture, and you can't bring it back and say, whoa, let's not run away with this term. So you have a website which has the kind of got all of it's the, as I say, the beating heart of your teaching. And if you could just say what that is for people to find it, please.
Yeah, it's simple. tantrailluminated.org, tantrailluminated.org. And that is the place to go to then find whatever you're interested in this domain, because that links to our learning portal as well as our live events and so on. But the learning portal, as you know, has a tremendous amount of material, courses, workshops, webinars, guided meditations, just a big library of material, embodiment practice, so much stuff. It's we're building it as a kind of attempt to give you everything you need, or everything anyone could need for the spiritual path, which means covering a lot of possibilities, because again, people have different aptitudes, and different things work for different people. So it's that's exactly what the tantric tradition tried to do, is to provide hundreds of different practices so that each person would find a practice that really works in their constitution. So in that sense, that's part of what makes it different. It's very different from some Vedantic paths which say, oh, just contemplate, who am I, or just do this. We provide an array of practices, not because you're expected to master all of them, but because as you kind of poke around amongst this embarrassment of riches, you will find something that perfectly speaks to you. And that's the key. So if you're willing to go on that adventure, it really is a wonderful path and a wonderful modality for people to explore. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that. And thank you for your massive output of work, and your generosity and your time today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ralph. And hope we get a chance to talk some more sometime.
Yeah. Maybe when the next book comes out. We've got 7 more conversations.
Yeah. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.